My name's Alex Campos. I'm a veteran, served in the Marine Corps, and went to Afghanistan in 2011. I got diagnosed with PTSD, got out of the Marine Corps. Real common story, just got really involved in drinking, lost my way, just wasn't sure, didn't have any control of myself, what I wanted, no direction, anything like that. The church that I was going to had a veteran PTSD group. In this group, I met Brian. He's here with me today. Brian one day brought to me this paper, and this paper was about an analysis of the gateway process. It's a declassified CIA document. Talks about types of methods working in tandem with transcendental meditation. I don't know about you guys. I've tried to meditate before. It's a lot of sitting down and I don't get anywhere. Trying to meditate in tandem with something like these Hemi-sync audio tapes has been, I don't want to say training wheels, but it definitely gives me results for the time that I put into meditating. Brian, how did you first come across this paper?
Yeah, it was actually like the end of 2021. COVID had kind of gotten to me. I'd been dealing with PTSD. I served from 2000 to 2005, Marine Corps Infantry 17. And when I got back, I started relying on like alcohol and coping mechanisms like that. I just didn't really have any effective way to manage the anxiety, but it just kept progressively getting worse and worse until alcohol just became a daily thing. And then it became a necessity to get to sleep. And next thing you know, it's like 15 years later, and your life is just completely slipped into something that's unrecognizable. At the end of 2020, 2021, I got to a point where I realized that like the kind of living that I was doing was more akin to survival, and it was the kind of survival that would probably kill me. So I had to like make some radical changes in my life. And one of them was just be different. So I stopped listening, stopped consuming the same information I'd been consuming, started looking for alternative outlets. And I found 3 incidences where I heard people talk about this paper, the analysis and assessment of the gateway experience. And so I tried to read it. It was incredibly dry. I couldn't get through it. I found some guy who had recorded it on YouTube. And so I sat and I listened to him. And after I got done listening to him talk his way through the paper, it was just like, I'm thinking to myself, man, if like 10% of what's in this paper is even remotely true, then I should be living like an entirely different, much better and more happy life. I sat down, I read through this, I tried to go through and understand exactly what was happening. I will say, it's important to note the importance of belief, because I came into this with a strong dose of belief about this working, just, reading the material, seeing like the genuineness, because this is not the kind of material that you would expect a career military officer to like openly communicate to a senior staff officer. The discussions that they're having here are just really wild and out of this world, quite frankly. I began to wonder, like, perhaps if I was able to incorporate these things. And so, you go out, you read this, you go and you find out that Hemi-sync is still like a fully functional operational company. They've actually got all this material that's been put into like a consumer format. And so it turns out they've actually got a Spotify playlist. So I went and started listening to the Spotify playlist, just started doing I wouldn't even say it was meditation. I just wouldn't listen to other stuff. I would just put this stuff in and let this be like what was going on in the background. A lot of theta music, which is supposed to improve like creativity, thought, things like that. And that was what I leaned on a lot. An album called Awakening Consciousness, just like an hour of playthrough of nothing but theta sounds. And I started noticing that like things were changing. I went from being like this crazy reactionary, anxiety-ridden PTSD veteran, chest thumper, to like when things happened, I could just slow down enough to think about it and to talk about it. And so I started talking about this stuff with Alex, because I know that Alex has like, similar issues with the PTSD. And, just when you feel like your life is out of control, you're kind of like, you're at an odds with your reality. It's like, what do you do from here? I mean, this is like the predecessor to schizophrenia. It's like, you got to do something to reestablish some control in your life. And so we started this journey together, kind of just first, prior to any entheogens, tuning in with this music, kind of using the sounds to create, brainwave synchronization that, for my money, in retrospect, allowed me to become, rather than like so focused on the past and so focused on the future and constantly racked with anxiety and depression, instead I became more of like a present person that was tackling things that would come at me as they would come at me. I don't think people appreciate, that the mind is a muscle, and that when you live in these like chaotic, anxious states, that muscle gets like really out of tune, and you have to do something to try to improve your ability to use it. And I just found that, through this brainwave synchronization, it's a pretty effective way to tune up the mind and get it to, I would say, like a higher state where you're capable of doing real thought instead of just like top-down thinking or judgment that tends to lead you to like repetitive behaviors that get you the results you don't want. So that's kind of where we picked up, at least getting into this. Maybe if we wanted to take a few minutes, we could talk a little bit about what Hemi-sync is, because in this paper they do talk about some fundamental concepts of biofeedback, transcendental meditation, and they discuss, they do a pretty big dive into the concepts of the physical universe as well. One of the things that they discuss in here, and I'll just read a direct quote out of the paper, but I think this really sums up, some of the great mystery of all of this. It's on the 24th page, and it's actually a quote, beginning of the 34th section, belief system considerations. In 1967, Alexandra David Neal, Lama Yogden wrote a book entitled Secret Oral Teachings in Tibetan Buddhist Sects, from which the following quote is taken. And I think that when you consider the treatment that we're talking about here, using like this vibratory method or using frequencies to try to affect the way that your mind or your consciousness is functioning, this is a pretty good summation of why it may work. It goes on to say, the tangible world is movement, say the masters, not a collection of moving objects, but movement itself. There are no objects in movement. It is the movement which constitutes the objects which appear to us. They are nothing but movement. This movement is continued in infinitely rapid succession of flashes of energy. All objects perceptible to our sense are phenomena of whatever kind and whatever aspect they may assume are constituted by rapid succession of instantaneous events. And so, like, when you get down to this fundamental concept that the universe is like a constant state of movement, and movement creates like frequency and vibration, I think for me, that's where I begin to make the connections about what these frequencies are doing to kind of bring my mind into an adherence with like a more natural state of where I should be, rather than like a really chaotic state of mind that I might be in after dealing with PTSD or anxiety or depression for years and years and years without any effective outlet. And I think that kind of takes us to talking a little bit about kind of what those aspects of Gateway are and how we were able to incorporate them and kind of what the results were. So if you want to, get into that a little bit, Alex.
Yeah, the paper is it is pretty dry when you try to sit down and go through it all, but there's a lot of key things about it that I definitely want to highlight. The concept of FFR, so frequency following response, is that what these audio tapes or the Gateway process is. It's its foundation, because they'll play a different sound frequency in each of your ears. Your mind will entrain to the frequency, to the beat frequency, which is what's in between them. And so they'll produce these audio recordings with the intent for that when your brain connects to it and synchronizes with it, then you'll be in a theta brainwave state or something similar, with the intent of getting you into snap into these different states of meditation. And there's different audio tapes, different waves. There's like an introductory one that kind of just gets you into it, which is why I just lean so heavily on this, because like I said, you tell me to sit down and close my eyes, that nothing was going to happen. But with these, just spending 10, 15 minutes, you get to a point that you snap into these meditative states. It was when I first had these experiences, is when I realized that, coming out of the military, drinking heavily, not doing a job that I want, nothing was right. I was surviving life. I wasn't living. These recordings actually allowing me to actually find a state of meditation and finding some peace in my day-to-day. I was able to organize my mind and my emotions in a way that it's kind of like having a cluttered room. I put everything where it belonged. I understood what was in front of me and how to go through it, because I knew what I wanted. And I wasn't kind of getting caught up in my depressions or anxieties by focusing on these troubles and problems ahead of me or behind me. When I spoke to Armand and some of the people at PPS, they recently brought me on as just to help volunteer and do the videography. They said, "Is there anything you want to talk about?" And I just couldn't help but think of just yes, because this has just been such a beneficial part of my life. I would just feel so foolish if I just let this opportunity go by and not show people what we've kind of stumbled upon, what it appears. I feel like I just went off on a tangent, Brian. Did I?
No, it's totally okay. In fact, I wanted to address it because, I mean, a lot of this, what we're talking about, I'm sure sounds pie in the sky. I mean, I would bet each of us has tried meditation in some form or fashion. We probably had some success. Maybe mindfulness is also a good way to look at this, because we're not talking about like religious adherence or techniques that are founded in any kind of other culture. So mindfulness is also a real good way to, talk about what we're doing. But let me read you another quote from this paper, because I mean, I get it. It sounds like this this is like too good to be true. You're telling me that I've been struggling with PTSD and I haven't been able to figure out how to manage my anxiety and depression for 15 years, and it's just this easy. I just want to read this and emphasize that this is kind of like, the person who wrote this paper, his name's Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonald. I went and tried to do a dive on his past to understand who this person was. I mean, is this like some, granola guy who made his way through the military and got to be a lieutenant colonel without anybody realizing what his beliefs were? And the only thing I could find on him is an intelligence debrief on Viet Cong operations in Laos in like 1959. So as best as I can tell, this guy's like a legitimate Army research. And this is actually done by Army intelligence, not by the CIA. The CIA are the ones who had the documents when they released it later on. But Army intelligence is actually the group that was doing this research. But here is McConnell's take on the situation. It's the motivational aspect in section 37. He says, the rate of progress is so much faster with the gateway approach than it is with transcendental meditation or other forms of mental self-disciplines, and its horizons seem to be so much wider that the discipline needed to practice it would seem to be within the means of even impatient, result-oriented, skeptical pragmatists in our society. Unlike yoga and other forms of Eastern mental discipline, Gateway does not require the infinite patience and total personal subservience to and faith in a system of discipline designed to absorb all the individual's energies over most of a lifetime. And so I really think that kind of sums up the beauty of this Hemi-sync approach, is it literally is addressing the fact that you're getting into like states of meditation that would be similar to transcendental, but it's highlighting the fact that this is so much easier, that when you're using the assistance of these audio tools, it's like your body is just like naturally snapping in. And I would attribute that to the brainwave synchronization. One of the things that we learned when we were doing this was this phenomenon called the Schumann resonance. And essentially what the Schumann resonance is it's the sound of our world collectively floating through space, grinding away. It makes a frequency, and that's frequency 7.83. In the link to the Spotify playlist we have here, the very first one that's on there, it's actually a Schumann resonance. And the reason I put it up there top is because it's a really interesting proof of concept. What will happen is when you put your earphones in, you're going to hear two distinct sound waves that are reverberating over each other. Wah, 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 wah. In time, you'll begin to hear your brain start to synchronize, and it'll turn those sounds into one uniform resonance. This is the operation that's happening when you're going through brainwave synchronization. So if you have any skepticism, obviously this probably won't assuage a ton of it, but if you want to check out the Spotify link, you can kind of put this in your ears and see what we're talking about. You can hear your ears adjust to the audio sound, and you can hear your mind begin to produce a single frequency. This is just how your mind is like, how your mind absorbs the sound and how it tries to differentiate. Because I mean, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but your mind is really looking for what's different in every situation. You know what I mean? That 7 hertz frequency, that's not 7 hertz. That's like 214 hertz in one ear and 207 in the other. And what you're hearing is the 7 hertz difference in the middle. That's what's creating the resonant frequency. So, I wanted to address that because some of this does sound like it might be too good to be true. But, in the paper, they do kind of address that this is just a significantly easier practice, attain states of meditation rather than the traditional ones that would require a religion's adherence or, decades and decades of dedicated practice. So, once again, I'd encourage anybody, feel free to check out the Spotify list, pop in some headphones and just kind of listen to your mind synchronize the sound. It's a pretty interesting phenomenon. At a certain point in time, what happened was after using the meditative tools for probably about 2 months, I had access to entheogens. And so we decided to incorporate those in some of our meditative practices. My goal, for me, I realized that a lot of my trauma may not necessarily be rooted in my military experience. If I look back generationally at like my parents and their parents, I can say that like not much of that family was handing down very good lessons generationally. Instead, you see like, generational examples of like trauma that's followed up by like alcoholism over and over again. So for me, a lot of it was understanding that these bad lessons I'd been picking up, they weren't lessons I picked up in 2000 or 2005. They were lessons I picked up when I was like a kid going through all my formative lessons, living in a home that was raged by, rage-filled alcoholics who were raised by rage-filled alcoholics who were raised by rage-filled alcoholics. And I was just like an echo of that past now. So it was like I had to start making some dramatic changes. And so my goal was to try to use the entheogens to try to allow myself to create more perspective. You take the music, you put yourself in a meditative state, you apply the entheogens, and then you go back into the meditative state. But you try, at least for me, what I would do is I would try to focus on like traumatic events that had happened to me. One of them that was a real good example and kind of like a common event when I was a kid, my mom would get real pissed off at me. She would, essentially sick my dad on me, and my dad had like no restraint whatsoever. whatsoever. So I got this vision of me being like a little 6-year-old kid just getting the shit kicked out of me on the floor by my dad, and my mom's just standing in the doorway, like with approval in her eyes, like this is exactly what I want. And so I spent time meditating on that scenario, just trying to create some more perspective. And what I did was, when I incorporated the entheogens, I found myself like almost able to elevate myself in that perspective. I wasn't that little kid who was on the floor getting the crap kicked out of him. Instead, I was able to like move myself to a corner of the room where I could look down and see what was happening. And when I saw what was happening was I saw a mother who had learned to do that exact same tactic from her mother, which I now understand she did, sicking an abusive alcoholic father on a kid who, you don't have the patience or the understanding on how to control. And then I was being attacked by a dad who had been constantly attacked by his dad when he was a kid. I mean, to the point where if you go back and look at my dad's history, like he's got the story that he just like nonchalantly tells about how his dad used to beat him so bad when he was 11, he pulled out a knife and stabbed his dad in the leg. And after that, they didn't see each other for like 5 years, So you can imagine like the parental tactics that were brought to the table when I was a kid. For me, a lot of it was like, taking the time to actually figure out where the wound was. And that's where the entheogens were real helpful, because what I found is that kind of stuff, it takes your ego, which is so typically in the forefront of everything, and it moves it to the background. And so now you're able to address like issues, hurts, problems, traumas, but not necessarily in a way that your ego is connected. It's a much more detached, like examinatory, perspective. You're able to kind of look at the situation and say like, this is what a human is experiencing in their human experience, rather than someone's doing something mean to me. So really, I think for me,
it's like you realize all the betrayal that you experienced in your life, none of it was personal.
Yeah, that in fact, this is a story that's been being written for generations. I mean, if you go back and you look at, what my family's been doing to each other, there's no confusion about how I ended up here. It's like, yeah, this is just like, almost a mathematical equation that would produce me. I mean, I in many ways feel like I was almost raised to go and fight a war. I mean, I was like signed up for the Marine Corps before I was 17. You take a kid who's raised without a lot of hope or optimism about their personal future, and you give them some kind of faux cause to get involved with, and a military to join. And that was me when I was 17, running off to war. Where, I mean, it was 2000, so the coal hadn't even been bombed yet. But yeah.
What this kind of helped put into perspective for us, and just kind of our just self-exploration, you're able to really address yourself and see what you want for yourself. I feel like a lot of people will identify themselves with their traumas. And I think for a lot of combat veterans that are suffering from PTSD, it's dominated their life. And just having these types of experiences for ourselves, it was just like, in my mind, I just always thought, okay, PTSD is a one and done. If you have it, it's a permanent thing. It's going to take over your life, and we don't have any treatment for it. And having this experience was like, we just don't know yet. We just haven't realized what we have. Brian and I had like a 6-month period that we applied these in tandem with entheogen. We started just exploring. Brad, yeah,
The psychedelics, they allow us to yield transcendent, what we call transcendent distance from our pain, right? From the wound, from whatever the PTSD wound is. It lets us stand back from it far enough to look down on it and see it without, panic attack or just freaking out. But so one of the things before I had my psychedelic healing journey, probably the most ridiculous thing I thought I'd ever heard of was self-compassion.
Yeah.
And it's like, why in the world would I need that? Or why would I do that?
It's not a government issue.
Yeah. So my surprise in my psychedelic journey, and this is my question, is my surprise was, okay, so one moment that I went back to is when I was a kid in summer camp. Our counselors wanted us to learn boxing. We're like 10 years old. They put gloves on us, and this kid was bugging the heck out of me to box it. And I was like, nah, man, I don't want to fight. I'm like, I'm not really into boxing, And he just kept bugging me and bugging me. And I finally like, all right, let's do it. And so we get gloves on, and I get out there in front of all the other kids and the counselors. And the kid proceeds to beat the shit out of me, like beat the living hell out of me for like, I don't know, it seemed like an eternity before the counselors finally stopped it. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the kid had just been to boxing camp, and he needed somebody to beat down to show off. And I did not know that I carried that for 40 years. And I forgot all about it, just buried it, right?
Yeah.
But going back in my psychedelic experience, I returned to that moment and thought, wow, that kid's dad must be a real asshole.
What's it like for him? What makes a kid into that? Yeah.
You know, and so I'm just wondering, like, when you went back into your experience, you love your mom and dad, you know, realizing this multi-generational dysfunction, if you've noticed any compassion for what, you know, for how they kind of landed there.
Oh yeah, I don't have, I mean, I talk to my dad and my mom almost every day, actually more now than ever. I don't have any resentment. In fact, when I look at that stuff and I see these wounds, all it makes me want to do is cry. It's just like such a shitty run, and we just should have snapped out of this sooner. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. It's like you're just handing down bad lessons. You know, they're not making you happy, and you just keep handing down these bad lessons. Yeah, that whole concept of self-compassion, that's so gigantic. That was a huge one for me too. Is on April 13th, I actually had like a gnosis moment of last year. What it was, I was doing a guided meditation, and one of the lines in there was, saying no to others is saying yes to yourself. And that like set off this whole like chain of thought where I began to realize the importance of being able to engage appropriate emotions about myself if I was ever going to be able to show that real emotion to anyone else. So I would put it another way: if I can't love me, I can't love anyone around me. You know what I mean? If I can't be patient with myself, then I can't really be patient with other people. And that, from my perspective, is the core of self-compassion. This whole idea that like, it's not I deserve because I'm entitled. It's I deserve because I'm a human having this human experience. And if I do it to other people because it's what I'd like to be done with me, I should do it to myself too. You know, it's just like a more holistic recognition that we have needs.
Talk about healing when you start having compassion for your abusers.
Yeah, well, I go to Ram Dass for that one. I was reading, I want to say it's Christopher the Mill, but he had, in one of his introductions, he talks about like being being part of the mongrel hordes, like devastating, you know, Europe and Asia, and you know, you're the rapist and you're the victim, and it's like, well, what, you know? So yeah, Ram Dass definitely does a good job capturing those paradoxical, like the paradoxical nature of what's going on right now, or at least where we're at. So the process that we were going through, it kind of developed. We started off with just doing the music, the Hemi-sync stuff, and then we, you know, began to introduce, I guess you could call it like a fungus-based entheogen. And then we introduced another one after that. And this is where I think things really began to take off, is using the two entheogens in connection with each other. You typically begin the day, you know, around 8 or 9 o'clock, and then by about 10 o'clock, you'd be ready to introduce the other entheogen. And what we would do is we would do typically like 3 to 4 meditative sessions. The first one would be just like a straight meditative session where we would, you know, have the music in about 20 minutes, and you'd spend the time, for me at least, I would try to come up with questions that I genuinely didn't have answers to, not things that just required more thought or just me to apply more logic to them. Like, what's something I don't know how to do? You know, that's been a big part for me, as I realized what was modeled for me by my parents was not how to be a healthy person. So if I want to learn to be a healthy person, I've got to go out and I've got to learn a whole bunch of new material, because this is not stuff that I learned during my formative years. You know, this is stuff I got huge blind spots on. You know, starting to ask those kind of questions, like for me, it was like, how do I be a better father? How do I build community? You know, I mean, you're talking about a guy who had PTSD for 15 years old. I mean, I kid you not, I've dealt with like rage, like just a snarling, angry dog of a man for like 15 years, just like waiting for that person that was going to set me off, because everything felt so personal. So I think for me, the idea of being able to go into it, say, I don't know how to do something, and rely on the universe was kind of like another good proof of concept. And so we'd spend the first meditative session about 20 minutes doing that. And then we would apply the additional entheogens. And those would normally be about 10-minute sessions. And it had some pretty tremendous breakthroughs, you know, to be honest with you. Had some really fortuitous synchronicities that took place afterwards, particularly when it came to the question of community. It was almost like I asked the universe, how do you build community? And that day they gave me a friend. Like I went out that night with my partner, and we ran into this guy, and he had joined us for a couple of the sessions. I just talked to him again on Saturday, you know, so it's like just this lasting community that's growing out of these experiences, you know. And I get it, you know, that these all seem like small potatoes, and Alex and I really aren't anything special. We're just people that are experiencing this universe just like you. It's just these little tools like made my life become so much more livable in comparison. I mean, I just think about all the medication I used to take to manage my anxiety on a daily basis. And now it's like, I'm free of all of that. I'm better at putting my emotions and my anxiety and my depression in the appropriate place. So like, I'm not dealing with obstacles that I can't get over. I'm just dealing with objects, and I can now pick up and I can assess and say, oh no, I know exactly what to do with you. But it requires giving yourself time to think, and that's what the mindfulness is for, or at least has been for me with the Hemi-sync. Is you're just giving yourself meaningful time to try to process this trauma and understand where you are and what to do to move forward.
I haven't gone into these trips. and not gotten a real answer. And just knowing what you want to get out of these trips, these experiences, being very intentional and deliberate with what you're doing. It's like life. If you're going to be going through it with intent, then it might work out a lot more within what you're actually looking for, instead of just running amok, so to speak.
That's actually a topic they discussed in the Gateway paper. They talk about lamp versus laser, that essentially we're just like these incredible sources of energy, but we spend most of our time shining that energy out into the universe like a lamp. And what they're talking about with the Hemi-sync techniques is refining that energy down to like laser-like focus, so you're able to apply it in more meaningful and helpful ways, rather than just kind of letting your energy drift off into wherever. So
yeah, and I mean, your energy, your life, just that's not something I've always kind of just been surviving life. And so like the concept of focusing it in this way is a little bit different than like the military experience, but I just was kind of always in the state of taking everything around me in at once, instead of going after and pursuing something that I wanted. Yeah, journaling community I think is very important, which is definitely why I got in contact and wanted to join Portland Psychedelic Society and just be involved, just to be in the space and just to have access to being in conversations with people and about this stuff. So if you are interested into like trying to replicate these types of experiences for yourself, you can't go after stuff that when you don't know what you want.
At the end of the day, you are putting yourself into an altered state. So you have to have some kind of mechanism to bring some of this wisdom and knowledge back with you, and taking time to reflect either like the day out. And what I would do is the next morning, I would be up at about like, and by 8 or 9, I would start writing just for like a half hour, 45 minutes, just about what had happened the day before, about what I could recall, what my memories were. I'll go back and occasionally read those. It's just interesting personal reflection. It's just an opportunity. But the whole idea is that what you're doing is a value. If it's not even a value to anybody else, it's a value to you. Take the time to document what you're doing. Take the time to write about your thoughts, your feelings, your takeaways. Because if you put 6 months between you and your last ethnogenic experience, there's a good chance you're not going to remember much of it other than that it happened. So the idea, if you're going to take some special time and, put yourself in a place where you're more receptive to wisdom, then make it a point to try to, document some of that wisdom. I would write down all my questions, write down the answers that I got, and like I said, it's not that it's important to anybody else. It's just that, for me to functionally get through this universe, I have to believe I'm important, and so I got to act like it. And part of that's like kind of keeping a record of what I'm doing. So I would just encourage anybody who, moves forward with this, especially on, any of those trips with entheogens, take some time to really write down what happened afterwards, reflect on it, take some time to figure out what the lessons are.
Yeah, I wasn't really a journaler either. I thought it was just kind of dumb, but man, what a difference. Journaling is integration.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's really tough to integrate without it.
Yeah, I was going to say about going into it, writing down your intention solidifies them, makes them much clearer. And then coming out of it, doing the journaling for me certainly is an anchor. You put it down there, and as you're writing it out, it too solidifies what you've been through. Another tremendous technique that Stan Groff came up with is drawing out a mandala of the experience. And it can be just a pencil drawing. It's nice if you've got colors, put it down as a picture that sort of encompasses the whole journey. And when you were talking about lasering and spotlighting and so on, I'm going to shift to a different modality, but NLP uses the concept of reframing. And what you're doing is going in and reframing those experiences that have altered you and set you on a path that you seem locked into. But when you go back to those experiences and reframe them in a different light, you're able to take a fork in the road.
Yeah, I like that. Reframing, that's good, because perspective shift is kind of nebulous, you know what I mean? Where are you ending up? But yeah, I like that, reframing.
It's what I call repairing your timeline. You take successive trips into your past and repair your timeline, and then come back to the present moment with a new story.
Yeah, for my end, I just, when you have PTSD, you're like trapped in the present, but you're not really in the present. You're like trapped when you got hurt, and you're pretending like you're living in the present. And so, for me, this whole process has, been very enlightening, just regarding how much trauma there has been in the past. And it's not just my trauma, it's like generational. When I go back, I don't get outside of a great grandparent before I have every single male from every grandparent I had died. on the great grandparents' side, one crushed by a phone pole, one froze to death, like just total tragedy. And I'm looking at my family wondering why my family can't raise whole people. It's because for generations you've had families that are raising kids by themselves. They're not doing it in the traditional like model where you get all the help. And so it's like you just end up with like people that are dissatisfied with the reality, because it's not a satisfying reality. You weren't supposed to have your spouse crushed, or he wasn't supposed to freeze to death. He was supposed to be there to help you, So when you just take a real hard critical examination of your family history, and I'm not even saying you have to go back very far. I would wager within 3 to 4 generations, we could probably find a pretty decent trend of trauma if you feel like you come from a family that's similar to mine, that there's really not a whole lot of deep digging that's got to go on here. But one of the things that did strike me out of this, and I would just, toss out this cliche, it's the concept of bearing. And that was a huge thing for me. When I first got out of the military, I used to do a boot camp for like at-risk kids. I worked at a facility with at-risk kids in Utah, and we would do this like monthly boot camp for them. And we would talk about the concept of bearing. And bearing was like, that we would address it as a nautical term, not necessarily the military one, but as a nautical term where you can set a course based on your bearing, but it requires 3 things. You have to know where you are, you have to know where you're going, and you have to know where you come from. And so I would always think about how I could apply that to my life, in order to use that as like a means of creating direction. But when I would just look at my life, it was really hard to get like an idea of how I would apply that. When I began to look generationally and apply that concept of bearing under those circumstances, it began to get a whole lot more obvious about where I was supposed to be going. You know what I mean? When I began to see the trauma that I was coming from, the trauma that my family had been raising people in, it actually became very obvious where I was now and the direction that, in fact, I wanted to begin to head as well. So that for me was a real cool tool, just being able to go back and be really, I use the word critical, but it's only critical in the sense that I'm just not buying the family lines anymore. Everything wasn't roses, everything wasn't okay. A lot of bad stuff happened. And then we need to talk about that and try to understand, because based on what happened, these people don't seem like they resolved these problems. And rather than resolving them, they just began to pass on a ton of bad lessons, and it's like, how much of that has been happening and how long has it been happening? And this poor guy for 40 years has been doing all my top-down thinking based on all those bad lessons. So it's like you're just caught in this cycle of failure, and you're very unlikely to get out of it unless you can have an opportunity, like you said, to reframe those moments in your timeline. It's like you're stuck, you're just stuck.
Me and Brian aren't any type of experts on any of this stuff, but we definitely feel like we backed into an effective method for a treatment for PTSD, and just hearing how psilocybin is moving forward, and for clinics being opened up, it's just, I have no doubt that there actually is going to be effective treatments for PTSD. I think you wouldn't be mistaken to apply some of this Hemi-sync stuff to it as well. And I think you would just reap some benefits from it. Brian and I are going to school, just be able to be in a clinic as this whole like career path kind of unfolds. So I'd love to have like a ranch, be able to hold sessions of just like what we've done. And I can't see this situation play out and not have people benefit. I mean, how much better would the world be if groups of people that are doing these sessions of just introspection and none of them are committing suicide? Like, everyone is being intentional with their introspection and discovering who they are, what they want out of life, instead of identifying with their traumas and just being stuck in that spot. They're actually finding a new stepping point into life that they're willing to pursue.
For me, this is just a real life example of kind of recapturing my life. I'd been dealing with PTSD for probably 15 years. When I first got out of the military, I went to school and I got like pretty much my degree knocked out in political science. I had like 2 classes left that I needed to take, but my anxiety and everything was so bad, I just literally just stopped. I didn't want to do anything. I had no motivation and just walked away. So as a result of, doing this meditation stuff, I managed to get back in school. I'll be graduating with my political science degree this semester. And then I'm trying to get the requisite courses to get into a master's program for psychology. So just trying to move forward and find ways to like help veterans. I mean, I think for me, the big thing is I wish I'd known you guys before I went through any of these changes, because it was so night and day, and as we begin to work more with people and the people that know them begin to see the changes in them. I mean, who I am today is completely undeniable to my family, my daughters, my partner, my mother, my father. They see the difference, but you guys, you don't know, you just know who I am now, So as we begin to work more and more with people and you begin to see the people around you change in like such incredibly positive ways, it's like I'm really hoping that that'll create like a very contagious environment for other people to get involved in this community.
So so syncing the hemispheres, right? So I mean, usually the left hemisphere is the one that's in control. It's the one that keeps you alive, right? I mean, it's sort of the battle ready hemisphere that categorizes and analyzes very quickly and makes lightning fast decisions and almost creates algorithms, almost a hologram of reality, right? This part of the problem is that, when you've got PTSD, you don't see the world as it really is. You see it as it's been pre-programmed for you by by your past, right? So the left hemisphere is basically in charge, and the right hemisphere is really the relational hemisphere. It's the spiritual hemisphere. It's the one that gets in touch with the universe. It's the one that has empathy and all these sorts of things, right? So, but in terms of accessing trauma, so I'm just trying to put a picture together in my brain of how this is working, right? So, because there's also something that therapists use called EMDR, right? Which is, I forget what it stands for, but both eyes or both ears. And I'm just wondering,
before we did this, the name of the Spotify playlist I'd made was actually Do It Yourself EMDR. So it's a very similar concept, except you're just going inward, and instead of using the visual stimuli, you're just letting your imagination create the stimuli, but you're using the sounds as well. So I apologize for interrupting, but yeah, absolutely.
Oh, no, it's cool. So, but two different frequencies, right? So as opposed to EMDR, which is like either in your eyes or in your ear, boop, 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 just this alternation. Instead of an alternation, it's both at once, and it's forcing, it's like if you look through a red lens and a blue lens, you're going to see, I guess, green or something. I don't know. So same story. You're basically forcing the hemispheres to sync up, to cooperate,
and producing a biofeedback environment, just like with EMDR.
So EMDR gives you same sort of thing, not nearly as effective as psychedelics, but gives you some distance from your pain so that you can deal with it. I mean, is that the same kind of an effect you get with the Hemi-sync?
From my perspective, I think that what happens is as we go through our day-to-day lives and we're just getting bombarded with all kinds of electromagnetic frequencies, you just got loads of chaos, even if you don't have like 5 or 4G pumping into your head, constantly, you just have the general stress and anxiety of the day. And it really does get your mind out of tune. We live kind of odd and unnatural lives in this modern world. For generations, we haven't lived like this, but now we're like thrust into this world where we don't have to do the hunter-gatherer or the agrarian stuff. We can just consume. And now we have a whole new list of like concerns. And so I think that what it does is it just gets your mind into a state of synchronization, kind of like the EMDR does, but the EMDR is acting like a prompt that allows you to do the work. And this is acting like a prompt as well, something that's queuing up your mind and getting it to a state where you're capable of doing the biofeedback kind of work, where you can actually make like some productive growth or address things with the level of detachment that you were talking about. And I would associate that with moving the ego to the background from the foreground. That's what makes it easier for you to become detached, because you're not distracted by the 5 senses anymore. You've gone completely inward, and you're tuning out, any of the other senses with the pure theta waves, which is supposed to help with, creativity, deep thinking, going inward and stuff like that. Theta was a big one for me. I love that one. That's probably my go-to when it comes to waves to listen to.
So it sounds like it quiets the mind as opposed to EMDR, which is kind of like focusing you on the pain, right? The Hemi-sync lets you quiet the mind so that you can have clarity.
Yeah, so for the Awakening Conscious one that I do, it's about an hour long. It takes about 20 minutes for me to snap in, when I'll really begin to feel like I'm in that meditative state, 15 to 20 minutes. But after that, it's like, yeah, imagine being able to take some time to mindfully consider some really bad events that happened to you, but do it in a state where you're clicked out enough, where you're like emotionally detached and you're able to use your like normal human intelligence to address things that have previously been too painful for you to even think about without crying, that they would just like trigger emotional responses. So that at least has been my experience. But you are right, like quieting the mind, just creating an environment where there's like the opportunity to actually do the work. Because for me, like when I would talk about some of my PTSD stuff, I'd be like crying in front of a total stranger and I couldn't even explain what was going on. So it's like the idea of wanting to spend time in that environment, you kind of get like hesitant about even talking about it or spending time thinking about it.
So it sounds like most of the time in our daily lives, we have monkey brain, right? We're like so preoccupied with like everything that's going on.
It's a very distracting universe.
Okay, so what I hear you saying, if I'm getting you right, is it lets you externalize all that stuff, push it out, and be present with yourself.
Yeah, and that was what I said in the beginning, it was almost like training wheels on how to be present. And I know that sounds so silly, but like, I mean, I think back on how I used to be. If I ever had a moment where I wasn't doing anything, the question always is, what am I going to be doing now? You never are just like present. You're never just there. It's always like, what am I supposed to be doing now? This is the anxious mind trying to make sense of a world that doesn't really make sense. So for me, a lot of it was slowing down. I started becoming a lot less reactionary. When I was presented with things that would typically gaslight me in the past, it was like I was able to look at it with a little bit more detachment and say to myself, like, what decision do I want to make about this? Not, I need to react right now.
The paper, I mean, you could read it yourself, or YouTube has people reading it, so you could just listen to it while you do some things. Speaks to like the level of quietude that your mind reaches when you snap into these states. I kind of think of it as cleaning a room. All these different traumas or just life experiences, it's not like you don't have a connection to them. It's not like you've never experienced them. You just know where to put everything, and you could take everything out individually and like spend your time with it and maybe empathize with another person, but it's not always out, so that you could always be having that on you, if that kind of makes sense.
To explain, I think, a little, Brad, what's actually going on internally with your brain with Hemi-sync is both of your hemispheres are functioning at different frequencies normally all the time. And your brain, because of that, you've got this swirl of things going on all the time. And what happens with Hemi-sync is with the different sounds, those different frequencies, each coming from a different ear, tuning into each separate hemisphere, they then link up at the difference of those frequencies, and the whole brain then syncs together. You've now got a brain working at one frequency. My experience with it is, at first you won't recognize that it's happening, but after a while you do it a few times and you do recognize it. You click into it, sort of, and click is probably the wrong word, but you're there, and you can feel your brain functioning as a one unit. And then to talk about the EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, you're working on specifically trauma that you've dealt with had to deal with in your life, and you're desensitizing yourself with it, usually with something moving in front of your eyes, a light or whatever. And then you go back and you reprocess that because you've now been desensitized and can look at it from a different perspective. The Hemi-sync gives you that in a whole nother way, and training your brain to a frequency that allows you to look at it again from a sort of disassociated perspective, for me anyway, and it does it very well.
Yeah, that's a great synopsis. Brainwave synchronization is the ultimate outcome, and it's just basically in training, both hemispheres of the brain, so they're operating at the same frequency.
I had a couple of questions for you. So I know you said that Spotify playlist, and then I know you mentioned one of the programs you were working through with Hemi-sync. And so besides your Spotify playlist, where would you think the best starting point is for us who don't have experience?
Well, you could go to Amazon, you could go to Apple Music. Hemi-sync is available through all of them. I know that they have the very first Wave album, available through Spotify and all these places. The other ones you typically have to pay for. I just want to emphasize, I've done the Wave program. I've made it through like the first 3 waves. I redid it again in January in preparation for this again. I didn't have a lot of the growth that I had just as a result of doing the Wave programs. It was actually just a lot of just applying the opportunity for the brainwave synchronization through the just general music that I found a lot of potential growth as well. So if you just do like any search terms against the Monroe Institute, or much more likely Hemi-sync, in Amazon or in any other music provider, there's a very good chance that they'll provide you with some of their material there as well. At least that's been my experience.
With the music that you're listening to, there you're just sitting, essentially not doing anything else other than listening to the music. Is that correct?
A lot of it, I would just sit at my desk when I was working, and I work in a law office as a paralegal, so I mean, I can just tune out a lot, and so I would just sit there and just have it on in the background. Well, that's how I started. I probably got about 2 months under my belt. Rather than listening to talk radio or other things that might, get me agitated or worked up, I just started listening to this and kind of, engaging in a more therapeutic environment throughout my day. After about 2 months, that's when I had the idea of incorporating the entheogens and doing like much more focused meditation with these tools. I mean, the first time I really tried to meditate was on April 13th. I was doing a guided meditation, and I had like a gnosis experience. It was a trip, but this was like an entheogen based trip as well. It wasn't like I was just using the music, but once I incorporated the music with the entheogens, it was like snap, like first time. It was like, holy crap, it was nuts. Ineffable is the term I would use, but yeah. So
like, let's say something like for this meeting, you could just listen to one of your Hemi-sync binaural beat music and like just be doing this meeting right now, or?
Yeah, well, you need to have it in both ears in order to create the synchronization. But no, a great example would be like when I finally broke down and read through the paper, I read through the paper reading or listening to the Concentration Hemi-sync album that they had. It's just like an hour of white noise that's in like a delta, I think, or something. I can't remember the frequency. And I was able just to sit down and like tackle this paper. I've read it like 3 times so far, and I've gone through and made really extensive markups. And I don't feel like I was capable of internalizing or interpreting the information the first couple of times I read it, So yeah, I mean, it just depends on the situation. definitely when I meditate though, I do use that. I almost look at it as like we as Westerners have become very indulgent. And so we as indulgent Westerners, we need the music too when we meditate rather than just like the patience to sit there and be quiet, and so it's like a crutch for us, on account of how thick our egos are. So
I think to get to the underlying question I think you're asking, Armand, is can I do this while I'm doing other things? And the answer is yes. It does require headphones or at least earbuds so you can get the separate frequencies, but you can definitely go about your day and you can actually sort of amp your day a little better if you want to focus on something. You can do beta or gamma waves, which are going to give you more of a focused but relaxed experience. I wouldn't recommend delta because that's your sleep.
Yeah, it's a sleep wave. I realized that when I said it. Yeah.
But if you want to get to sleep, it actually does help, pop them in before you go to sleep and it'll help you get there. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they've got it for everything. They've got it for peak performance, for concentration. They have sleep ones that they do. They also have guided ones that are really cool. They had some like positive affirmation guided ones. If you had a traumatic childhood and maybe you genuinely didn't hear your parents say, I love you that much. I mean, one of the big things for me is I've been doing talk therapy through all of this. And something that I had revealed for me is that kids who grow up in homes where they're like ambivalent or they're uncertain of their parents' love, they're almost like destined to have mental health problems. And so if you've got that in your background where you kind of came out and you hit the real world and you weren't quite sure if your parents really had your back, I'd highly recommend some of these affirmation things because it might be the first time you're hearing these things and now you're saying them to yourself. So there's a lot of power behind that, but that kind of stuff is all included in the playlist as well. But yeah, there's just a litany of uses for this meditation. They have them for healing work too. I've tried this before with some knee pain where they do like color healing energy where you focus on the color blue and you'll like apply it to the body part in your mind. And at the time, I definitely noticed a reduction in the pain, but they've also got some studies where they show this being used in coordination with anesthetics, and it results in the reduced need for anesthetics. So basically, if you're using Hemi-sync with traditional anesthetics, you're using less anesthetics to treat the patient to get them into that painless state. So, there's just a lot at work here. It's just a very intriguing concept. The idea that like sound vibrations could tune up your mind,
For me, I found, and I've found this to be true. I have been working with the chronic pain group with PPS, reimagining chronic pain, and a whole lot of people are dealing with chronic pain. I have found that mindfulness meditation, as good as it is, because of the focus on much of the focus on the body and doing the body scans and so on, actually amps my pain up. And so instead of using mindfulness, I'll use visualization, meditations, or just music, not getting into the scanning. But it's also true for me that doing color healing meditations do help with pain. But that's an active going to the point where the pain is and applying a color. I use green myself, but it works for me too.
Yeah, just something I've dabbled with, but these are things just completely unaware of, a year ago. It's just unbelievable how many tools there are to help you heal when I spent 15 years saying I had PTSD and I don't have any tools to help me out. And it's like, now that I've kind of turned this corner, there's just an incredible abundance of them. But I go back to all of this. It starts with belief, I think a lot of it had to do with how the information was presented. I went and I did some research on the guy in McDonald, and he does not sound like a crackpot. He sounds like a legitimate, Army intelligence officer that was tasked with doing a research and analysis of a very bizarre program. There's more to the history of the program. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Men Who Stare at Goats, but this paper is written under Stubblebine's direction, and this is the guy that Men Who Stare at Goats is based off of. So this was definitely a weird bend that military intelligence took in the early 80s, trying to create like super soldiers through meditation. So
yeah, the guy who actually sent out to have the gateway process like investigated was known for actually trying to like walk through walls and trying to like bend spoons at like military ceremonies and stuff like that. But
yeah, I think he got terminated because he tried to bend a spoon in front of his superior commander as a general, and he believed that he was a Satanist as a result of it and got drummed out of military intelligence. So it's a wild world.
Taylor asks if we have any experience or knowledge of Hemi-sync. I've never even heard of Hemi-sync. I wonder if it's similar type of principle, just with a different group of people producing these type of thing. But no, I've never heard of Hemi-sync. Have you heard of it, Brian?
No, could you share a little bit about it?
There are a number of organizations out there put together what you could call Hemi-sync. I mean, really it is.
Sure,
it's
right.
Using different frequencies in each ear, and how they apply that, whether it's subsonic or whatever. And subsonic is kind of a misnomer because you have to be able to hear it at one level or another, but it can be subperceptual in terms of those frequency differences. And lots of people have put together their own
Sure.
Hemi-sync, if you want to put it that stuff. So I wouldn't
Right.
be surprised if Holosync is another take on the same
Mhm.
technology.
Yeah, it is. It came out after Hemi-sync.
I haven't explored the various different types of versions or different people's takes on it. I've just been focusing on using just Hemi-sync. It has all these original patents, and it was just where we started with square one, and I feel like there's still more to discover in these tapes, but I would like to do like an actual side by side comparison and see if I get the same thing out of a different type of a different production.
I'm looking at this information online, and it seems like it's almost identical. Use of audio tools for brainwave synchronization, improved focus, creativity, relaxation, which is all the stated goals. But the thing about Hemi-sync is Hemi-sync's got like this aspect of it where once you get to the first two waves, they're talking about like remote viewing and all kinds of other crazy stuff. That's kind of like, whoa, this is next level. So,
but I do, on there, it's easy to find. I think a lot of the recordings are yet to purchase them, but one of the free ones is Wave One. I might just be titled like Introduction, but in that, if you haven't meditated, you haven't gotten a routine of meditation yet. I think it's a really good one because it's guided. The guy you're listening to, he explains the science eloquently, clearly, that you can understand it. And it's a very good first one if you're kind of getting used to the idea of meditation and you want to kind of understand the science of what's going on. The Wave One is definitely one to check out.
If you are going to do the waves, I'd also recommend you consider looking at that Gateway Intermediate Handbook or Workbook. It's from the CIA Reading Room. But the only reason I say that is because he gives you a lot of verbal instructions that might be a little bit confusing. Oh, I'm not sure if you did or not, but it illustrates what these movements actually look like. So when he tells you to roll to your side in a meditation, they'll provide an image for exactly what they're talking about or how that's supposed to look. So I found that to be pretty helpful just to have some kind of illustrations, because like these are things I've never done before, so you don't really have any perspective on like whether or not you're doing it right. So yeah, there's a pretty handy little workbook that goes along. And there's also a sheet in the workbook that would, I think, encompass some of the traditional journaling questions you might have. So you have an opportunity to record some information on more of like a formal worksheet that's in there.
Right. The second to last page of this workbook is actually where we took a lot of our journaling notes from. It goes for just like your energy level, your mood, time of day. It talks about your diet, medicines that you're on, psychotropic drugs, room temperature, outside weather, even the moon phase. I don't have any insight into anything like that, but I look it up every time I'm using this just to jot it down, just to see if there's any type of consistencies or anything to take from it. Definitely recommend people do, just to look into it themselves. I think there's a lot of good stuff in here.
There's a lot of material that demystifies this stuff, because the whole concept sounds pretty wacky when you take it in as a whole, but if you just look at it and you consider yourself, what can I do to internally create improvement in my mind to help me recover from past trauma? It's maybe a much more simple approach, so yeah. And I think maybe that's where that Holosync might be a good tool for you to use, is because if they're not going to, spend time doing the color healing or the remote viewing or any of those kind of things, or astral projections, then the Holosync might be a great way just to get this experience without having to dip your toes in those kind of waters either.
I kind of encourage someone enough to investigate for themselves a little bit into this, because it takes a lot of concepts, remote viewing, color healing, all these types of like woo-woo types of things, puts it in terms of physics. And I think it kind of demystifies it, especially for a lot of veterans that might be very hesitant or standoffish to something like this. And meditation, it's just not something, I don't know many other veterans outside of like a community such as this that meditate. But when it's put this way, in just these terms of physics, it's just very digestible and it's a lot easier to understand.
They lean a lot on the work of Itzhak Bentov. He is a Jewish engineer, developed Israel's first rockets. He died tragically in like 79 in a plane crash. But we're not even talking about the most interesting aspect of the paper. We haven't even talked about the absolute. Bentov provides like a physical model for the universe. That's like one of the most compelling things I've ever heard in my life. And it's just like seamlessly incorporated in this paper. So I'd encourage you guys to check it out. I mean, maybe we could talk about the absolute at a later date. But yeah, it's just so bizarre. I mean, including like a model for how our universe looks. Like he talks about like this concept of an egg, and there's some material out there online. He's got 2 books, Stalking the Wild Pendulum and another one I can't recall the name of, but it's got consciousness in the title. But they're just phenomenal books. This is a man who was way beyond his time, and this is kind of like a predecessor to the holographic universe that you saw Talbot write about, and some other guy, I can't remember his last name, but he wrote another pretty good book about holography. But yeah, this is what he captures, that basically this universe that we're living in, all of this is possible because it's actually a hologram. And so it's really wild. It's very compelling. It's really interesting information, so yeah, like I said, this isn't even the most interesting part of the paper. There's like a whole nother aspect of it that's a lot more far out and wild.
Yeah, Alex, Brian, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you for all your input. That was awesome.
Great talk. Thank you guys so much. And if you guys feel compelled, don't forget, feel free to donate to Portland Psychedelic Society. It's all volunteer run. Hope to see you guys next month.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.